Crikey. Thanks very much, Mick. So I just thought I'd start off, well, first of all, saying thank you very much to the Arbor Association for having me here and letting me speak about this. It's a subject that's really dear to my heart. But I thought I'd just start off just sort of giving you a little bit of background about myself and how I got into environmental arboriculture, some of the stuff I've been doing and some of the problems that I've seen, and then also the results of a big meeting that we had in January this year with a few key players in the industry about the subject. So I thought I'd start off with an embarrassing picture of myself. I've been an arborist since I was 18. I started work at a place called Ickworth Park in Suffolk, where I learnt to climb. Surprisingly, I've managed to survive, so the arborists in the audience will see that absolutely everything I'm doing here is wrong. I'm standing on the branch I'm cutting off, which is kind of a major no-no. And after that, also, there's major crimes of fashion against arb going on here, especially with that noddy helmet I've got on. But anyway, so I started work at a place called Ickworth Park in Suffolk, as I said. It had a profound effect on me because it's a brilliant site for ancient and veteran trees. As a young man, I was able to climb these trees, and I had this amazing sort of a feeling, a sense of connection with the past. I really felt connected to them. Beautiful things to look at, and amazing to be able to climb them, and that really had a big effect on me. After a couple of years, and I worked through the '87 hurricane there, so that was also interesting times. But after a couple of years of working there, I left to be a freelance climber, and then after that, a couple of years later, in the early 90s, I started my business. So in my business, we're very lucky that we still work for the National Trust, and we also work at Ickworth. In fact, some of my guys are actually working there today, which is a bit ironic. But I formed this connection with the National Trust, and after about 10 years of contracting, I kind of got to that point in my career where I'd sort of was wanting to know a bit more about things, and in particular old trees. And when I heard there was a course at Hatfield Forest called the Biology of Decay course, which was run by Jill Butler, David Lonsdale and Keith Alexander, where for the first time they put together all aspects of old trees, and it was how they grew, how they decayed, how they all the things that lived on them, and it was a brilliant course, and it kind of completely changed my outlook on trees. So, but it's whilst I was there, I met Vicky, and Vicky was the site manager at the time there, and Vicky said to me that she'd just had the site surveyed by Neville Fay and Treework Environmental Practice, and that they were looking to find some contractors to carry out some what was new and experimental work at the time. And so I kind of jumped at the chance of that, but what was kind of groundbreaking at the time, that Vicky had this idea that instead of asking us to pay to go on a course, she paid us to go on the course, and that was like, okay, I'll have a go at that, and that was great. So we went on the course, and what happened was that at the end of the course, if you sort of seemed to have the right aptitude, you'd get selected to then go on and do the work that came about from this tree survey. And we're very fortunate that got selected along with a few other companies, and it was kind of a collective of companies, which is interesting because it's a very sort of Swedish idea, even though Vicky wasn't married to a Swede then. So that was cool. But anyway, so fast forward 30 odd years, and now running this arbor-approved contracting company in Bury St Edmunds, and we get to work at some of the great sites around the UK, including Hatfield Forest, Sherwood Forest, Aspel Close in Suffolk, Ickworth Park still, and others. I thought I'd just start off because my experience of this type of work is generally just with lapsed pollards, and I thought particularly if we've got sort of foreign guests here that people aren't aware exactly what a lapsed pollard is, and sorry if you do. But I just thought I'd start by just describing what I consider as a lapsed pollard. So it's usually a tree that has a low, squat bole, nearly always hollow. They would have had their tops removed when they were very much younger, and really small trees, and they were, to coin a TED phrase, a working tree. So they would have been cut for things like fodder for animals, for timber, for firewood, and all sorts of other things like that, and shipbuilding, things like that. And they would have been cut in cycles, so they would have been cut every sort of 6 to 25 years. And a lapsed pollard is a tree that hasn't been cut for a long time, and very often these crowns haven't been cut for 150 to 200 years, the type of trees that I've been working on. There are issues with that, in that as they get large, and you can see a bit dropped off there, they often large open canopies, often associated with decay, and you have these big crowns sitting on what are hollowing boles. And the problem was that, as over time, that sometimes these trees do fall apart. And at Hatfield Forest, they were starting to recognise this, and in the 1970s, they were concerned that their lapsed pollards were biomechanically failing, and that there was issues with, when these big branches came off, that they might tear down the trunks. It left the crowns open more to further wind throw, and also when these big branches tore down the trunks, they're often quite fragile, that they sometimes, it led to the demise of the tree. Also, great loss of photosynthetic material at the same time. So the National Trust recognised this. I've just seen the knowledge. Recognised this in the 1970s, in the late 70s, and thought they'd try and do something about the trees failing. So they decided to start a repollarding program. And what they did is cut the tops off the trees in a wanna, and you can see the results of it. About 10% of the trees that were cut, first of all, many of the trees, as Luke was saying, they did start to grow initially, but after some time, they started to die, and ultimately 90% of the trees that were cut died. This tree, which is a really iconic tree at Hatfield, well-known tree, was one of the ones that was cut and did manage to survive, and perhaps that tells us something. It had really good vitality. So around this sort of time, the Ancient Tree Forum had formed, and people were starting to talk about old trees and the way they grew. And when I used to look at an old tree that had a dead top, I thought it was dying. I thought it was dying from the top down. And what we now know is that, to coin a TED phrase, that the trees were growing down and or retrenching. And you can see here, where you get these dead branches coming down, and that what the ATF were first discussing in the early days is that what we're seeing was that lower down there was lots of stored up live growth, and it was this lower secondary canopy that was really, really important. It was kind of the tree's insurance policy for further growth. So you can see here, this is a tree at Netcastle Estate that Ted showed me, and it's the first tree that I've ever seen where you can see how the crown has died. You can see all the big dead branches, or retrenched, or grown down. But the secondary crown that was lower down has regrown. And in this case, it's the first one that I've ever seen of where the crown is actually starting to overtake the retrenchment. So what's interesting about this is that the crowns can come and go, and over many, many decades, and possibly longer. So at the time, just before the survey was done, Neville Fay was developing ideas about retrenchment, and he came up with the genius idea that could we mimic the retrenchment or the crown dying, back in the periphery dying, because he was thinking about pruning these trees and trying to stop the biomechanical failure of the trees. And he came up with the idea of retrenchment pruning. And what was interesting about this is that the tree would be cut in stages over decades rather than 1 year. And each time it was cut, it would allow the crown to regrow and the roots to recover. And then in cycles of anything from 5 to 8 years, the crown would then be cut a bit lower again and a bit lower. So that ultimately you'd end up with a lower, what was then mechanically produced secondary crown. And this secondary crown could then go on to form another new crown, which then could perhaps be managed in cyclical form. So those of us that got selected on the course sort of jumped in with both feet and set about this work, and it's in about 2002 we started doing this, so we've been doing it a long time now. And we started making the first cuts, making these stage cuts, and it was a really exciting time because it was completely, to my mind, experimental. We'd seen Neville's guys come and give us a demonstration how to do it, and after that we were on our own. And it was a great time because we shared the work with all these other contractors. And it was nice to work with other contractors, because often as contractors we jealously guard our work and we don't talk to one another. And suddenly here we were all working together, and it was a great way of sort of sharing ideas and an exciting time. So can you remember this picture? I'm going to show you a picture of this tree a bit later. If I can get it to go. So another feature of the type of work that we've been doing was using stub cutting. And you can see there, that's where a stub's been cut, and there's stubs all over this crown. And the idea that was, and that was in conjunction with some other cuts as well, but primarily stub cutting. And the idea of stub cutting that we thought at the time was that when you cut, you leave a stub, that rather than target pruning, you get an explosion of like frithy growth around that stub. Sometimes the stub would die back a little bit, but usually we're finding that we were getting growth coming anything from 10 to 30 centimetres down the stem. And the idea is that, as we made each cut, that growth would force down the stems, and that when we came to make the last cuts, which would be anything from 2 to 3 metres above the bowling, we would have that lower crown, that lower secondary crown that I was talking about a minute ago. So here's an example of a lapsed hornbeam pollard at Hatfield. You can see all the usual features, bowling there, crown on it. And this has had its first cut, so it's just after it's cut. So very small cuts, you can hardly tell it's been done, lots of photosynthetic material still in the crown. And then after a number of years, we started getting on to the second cuts. And here in the crown, you can see that the cuts on the top of the crown are starting to get much larger. You can see that the stub's there. And in the background on the left, you can also see an oak that's been cut, that's had its second cut, and you can see all the growth on the ends of the branches there. A few years later, 15 plus years later, with some of these trees, we're starting to get into the third cuts. Now, it's at this point, I was starting to get a few alarm bells ringing. I was getting a little bit worried about what we were doing. And you can see here that this is a hornbeam just about before its third cut. There it's been done, and that's due another cut, so that would have 4 cuts. And at the time I was starting to think, we're actually removing a huge amount of vegetation here. I was estimating anything from 40 to 60% of the crown volume. And I thought, we don't even do that in conventional arbs, so why on earth are we doing this to our really old, vulnerable trees? So another example here, previous to the tree having its third cut, this is another hornbeam pollard, and you can see it here during. That's not a filter, it's bloody Baltic in the East Anglia in the winter. But I was thinking about this. You can see where the cuts are being making, and that this crown would have been sort of coming down like this. But then it was going to need another cut a bit lower down here to meet the final objective. And that worried me, because I was thinking about the size of the wounds we were making, and they were becoming larger and larger and larger over time. And I just thought that goes against the grain with me. So I call this the hedgehog tree. And it's because what I was observing about this tree, and I sort of hate this tree, is because the cuts that we were making is they were all shooting and rocketing up skywards. They weren't growing down at all. I was just seeing that growth going uphill, not downhill. And you can see it's all on the ends of the branches here. Nothing going on in here, nothing down here. And to be fair, the idea was that it came down and that hopefully there was stuff down there, but it's just all on the ends. And I was starting to think, Ted and others mentioned mildew. Oak is really susceptible to mildew, and where we are in East Anglia, we get a lot of it. And I was worried and seeing, trees like this getting affected by mildew, particularly when you get this explosion of growth. So we've got a lot more photosynthetic material then being prone to the mildew. That was a concern. So it's about, I've been sort of banging on about this a bit amongst friends and colleagues for the last 5 years or so, and I've been talking to Ted about it, and Ted said to me, you need to come see a mate of mine, and this is his friend. It's Professor Mick Crawley. He's an emeritus professor at Imperial College London. He's a professor of plant ecology and an expert in oak, and he's got a scarily varied collection of oaks around the campus, and it's also the campus where Ted worked for 35 years, Ted? Yeah, as a technician.
I went on holiday there.
And what Mick had said to Ted was, I think oak trees stop growing at 40 years, and Ted in height, open-grown oak trees, mind you. And Ted said this to me, and I thought, that sounds a bit odd. But he said, you want to come down and have a look? And I said, yeah, of course, I'll come and have a look. And so we went down to Sealwood, and this is Mick, and that's Ted. And he showed us these two trees. So that the tree here is a parent tree. It's an ancient oak. You can't see it very well here. It's just difficult to photograph because of all the other trees around it. But what Mick had done is, in the early 1970s, he planted an acorn of this tree. And he planted it, and he said it grew like stink for the first 40 years of its life. And then he said it's topped out. And he said it hasn't really grown in the last 10 years. In fact, it's almost identical height to its parent tree. And what he was saying is, he said, I think oak trees, open-grown oak trees, when they get to a certain point in their life, and after perhaps 40 years, they're self-optimized. They've got to the height they need to get. That's the maximum height it needs to get to harvest as much sunlight as it needs. And then it's the lateral branches that start growing, so it starts growing wider. Now, I didn't really register anything about this when I first saw it with Ted, and I sort of went away, and then that night I slept on it, and I woke up the next morning, I got really excited, rang Ted up, woke him up, which is a little bit awkward, and I'm sorry about that, Ted, but I just wanted to talk to him about it because I thought about the implications of this in some of the pruning work that we've been doing. And also other things like, if we've got 1,000-year-old oak trees in the UK, and oak grows at maybe 10 centimetres a year, why aren't they 100 metres tall? And also, that made me also think about things like, if these trees, once they self-optimize after 40 years, and they start to grow laterally, they produce these huge, wide-spreading branches. And I thought like, a good example of that would be the major oak in Sherwood Forest, where if you see that, it's just got these enormous side limbs that then try and support these great limbs that then to try and harvest as much sunlight as possible. So it made me think, and it's kind of echoing some of the stuff that John's just said, is that when we're cutting in the retrenchment pruning, and we're getting all this growth on the ends, is all that growth, is all that doing, is it just trying to put that 40-year spurt on? If the vitality of the tree is good, all it's doing is just going up, and I just thought it's never going to grow down. So it also made me think that should we actually, and a bit like what John said, thinking about the torsional twisting on these trees, should we, and also that the fact that they're predominantly growing sideways as they get older, is should we, if we need to do any pruning, should we actually be concentrating the pruning on the periphery and the sides of the canopy rather than the top at all? Do we need to even touch the top? Because it's done, it's growing. So a few other things that were bothering me is, again, kind of what John, I hadn't heard John speak about this stuff, but there's so many similarities in the way we're thinking. Is that, again, taking the top off that tree, leaving those stubs, do we actually remove the dynamism of the way the tree moves and actually stiffen the branches? So then loading the top of that branch with what is a pom-pom of growth on a stiffened stem that then sits on a decaying and hollowing trunk. I didn't think that was perhaps ideal. Also, I was worried about with all this growth on this thick thatch, that it wasn't allowing the light into this lower canopy. You can see here, it's just all on the edge. There's not much going on inside, and that was another concern. But in the same time, I then started thinking, as we made these bigger cuts, as we came down and down, were we actually, again, stuff that John's saying, actually firing up the fungi that's latent in the tree by aerating it? So could we actually be increasing decay by pruning? And again, and perhaps lastly, I also thought that I'm not sure whether we can actually mimic a tree growing down, using these techniques, because the tree perhaps isn't in the actual life phase of retrenchment. Does the tree actually need to be in that life phase, and can we actually mimic it by cutting mechanically? Because when that vitality is good, all it wants to do is go up and put that 40-year growth spurt on. And also, we're starting to see them fail. So this is an example of a beech at Epping Forest, and it's one that's been pruned and failed. And we're starting to get a few notable examples also at Hatfield Forest. So I don't know if you can see, but this has had a first cut. There's some beans and cuts up there. Following about 5 years afterwards, the top, that's the second cut. Again, you can see all the cuts up there. And this is on the exit route as you go out. It's probably the biggest tree in the forest. But last autumn, bosh. Sadly, that failed. And you can see my colleague Stuart here, how big a limb that was. And Paul Muir actually then did a pull test on that. So the remaining stem is still standing, which is great. But there are other little things that were going through my mind as well. And as we were getting to these second and third cuts, one of the key features of environmental arboriculture is all to do with the splits, the cracks, the hollows, the dead wood, the decaying wood, all that. It's so important, for saproxylics, all the stuff that we all know. But we're going to be cutting that off. If we were going to get down to that 2 to 3 meters above the bowling, this stuff was coming off. And I didn't want to do that, so I kind of fell out of love with it. At the same time, it's all the roosting and nesting species. It's all the other things that live in the tree. The beetles, the insects. And I've a couple of years ago turned 50, and for my 50th birthday, I went to go and see the coastal sequoias and the giant sequoias, and did a tour of trees in California. Holiday of an absolute lifetime. And then when I came back, I reread Wild Trees, which is a book about Steve Sillett, the climbing botanist. And he was saying stuff in that book that he said when he got up those trees, he said there was stuff up there that wasn't supposed to be up there. They were finding, all sorts of different things up those trees that weren't supposed to be up there. And that made me think about what we've been doing. It made me think, it's like, what's up those trees that we don't know about it? What's living in those trees that we don't know about that perhaps we're cutting off? And I don't mean any disrespect to ecologists, but primarily I think with old trees, the focus for the ecology of the trees has been the hollowing, and quite rightly so. It's the hollow trunk, and it's because ecologists don't tend to climb. And so the focus has been on that hollowing trunk. So I really think that we need to think about that, and I think in future we need to consider looking at what's in the upper crown of the tree and perhaps trapping it. And I've got a mate called Jamie Simpson, who's the tree and woodland guy and arborist at Knepp Estate, and he's actually done this, and he owns a wood and with a few ancient trees in it, and he started doing that, and he's exactly what Steve Sillett said. He's finding stuff up in the crowns of these trees that's not supposed to be there, and are we missing a trick? And I just think we need to think more about that in the future. So I mentioned that we had a meeting. Neville Fay and several members of his practice met at Hatfield Forest. including Vicky, who bravely chaired it. And we also had Luke Steer, who spoke yesterday, and also representatives from the National Trust. And we kind of had a look round and discussed what had been going on, and I expressed my fears and worries and things like that. And after also with a long conversation with Nev has said that what's actually happened, what we've been doing, is actually not what he intended retrenchment pruning to be. It's kind of morphed into, for various reasons, it's kind of morphed into something that he didn't originally intend. So retrenchment pruning, as we've been doing it at Hatfield, is off the menu. Neville did tell me that and if you read his book, Trees, A Lifespan Approach, he does talk about the cut should be no bigger than 50 mil. When I read that, I thought, that's not what we're doing, you know. So he feels, and I'm not sure if I can completely understand it, but he's actually talking about sort of tip pruning the periphery of the canopy only, and in doing that, it's trying to stimulate his word vigor, and I think that's and he'll tell you much better than I can. I'm not sure I completely understand that, and we have done tip pruning at Hatfield Forest, but I can also see that there might be a few problems with that, and again, if you tip prune the periphery of a crown, I think you're still going to get branches growing upwards. Still, particularly with the oak, it's going to be prone to mildew, and also it doesn't do anything about the the torsional loading, about how we can perhaps where we need to carry out some crown stabilisation. So, in conjunction with Luke Steer, I'm very, very fortunate. I also work at Sherwood Forest, and Luke has a slightly different approach to the management of the trees there. Instead of surveying them and having a long period in between each survey, Luke goes and looks at them every 18 months. And so you look at them in the leaf, and you also look at them outer leaf. And I think that's an interesting and a good idea. And instead of trying to predict what's happening or trying to predict a 30-year program for the trees, it literally just highlights certain limbs that may require work. And we sometimes even go up there and we do the very technical wobble test, which we just wobble it just to see, and John's going to hate that. And so what we tried to do there is, instead of, when we do need to prune limbs, and this might just be one limb on the tree, and it's not overall crown reductions, so you target the pruning to certain parts. So we can actually, it's more crown stabilisation rather than retrenchment. We've been using a technique called reduction via thinning, or older arborists know it as drop crotching. And I think it might be appropriate for this type of thing, because where you get these long limbs poking out of the canopy, you can pull them in, and it's like the idea is not to stimulate growth at all. It's not to, so we don't use stub cutting at all. You can see here, this is a tree that we did, and 2 years later, you can see that crown has hardly changed. We have taken a few branches off, and what I think is potentially a good idea about that is that we're not getting the mildew, so branches that could be prone to mildew, and also we're not getting those pom-poms of growth on the ends. So I'm going to speak a bit quicker. Lastly, well, not lastly actually, I've been to Ashley Common recently, and I think other arborists are starting to think along the same lines. And you can see this tree. I thought it was a good photograph because it's the tree in the middle that in actual fact you can see kind of two styles of pruning on the same tree. And on here you can see the stub cutting, that pom-pom of growth, kind of like the lion's tail on the end of the growth. And then you can see up the top here, they've actually kind of reduction via thinning the top of the tree. So you've got foliage up the top rather than hard cuts. And I think in actual fact what may have happened is they've cut it and it's died, those stubs have died. But I just thought it was an interesting, so you could see one against the other. But also potentially by reduction via thinning, you can possibly open up areas of the crown to allow light in, if that's what your objection is. So if you don't know what reduction via thinning is, it's really difficult to photograph. It's really so I thought I did a thing on the kitchen table, just quickly to show you. So imagine that this is your long, extending, perhaps lateral limb. You cut that off. There's some lower limbs here that kind of look like they might elongate as well. Take those off, and that's the kind of the principle. And why I think it's good is that the cuts in there, it's not going to produce lots of growth. And also try and imagine that that limb could possibly be 2-3 meters long, and just apply that, and it could just be one limb on the tree that. Anyway, so that's what we've been thinking about. So this is the tree that was asked you to remember earlier. It's had actually 2 cuts, and Jeff Monk from Treework Environmental actually resurveyed Hatfield a number of years ago now as well, and he started using the terminology "manage as a high canopy veteran," and I really like that. I think it's great, and so we have tried to do some reduction via thinning to the top of this tree, and you can see that it leaves more photosynthetic material on. We have in some places, as I said, it's not a perfect example, but you have reduced the loading on some of those branches, keeping the biodiversity in the crown of the tree. To my eye, it still looks like a beautiful veteran tree, and the aesthetic does bother me, and I do think that's important. So kind of in conclusion, I think it's a really exciting time, but I also think that our trees have never been under so much stress. And someone said to me once, I think that there's been more pests and diseases affecting our trees in this century than the whole of the last put together. These sites are where we go are becoming much more popular. There's a lot more people going to them. Where we are in the east, it's so dry that water is a problem. And it's also things like pollution in the air, pollution in the rain, and it's also things like increased nitrification, urbanization of these sites. Hatfield Forest, they've built literally hundreds, if not thousands, of houses around it. And what do at the weekend? They take their dog for a shit in Hatfield Forest. So, and we're guilty of that as well, because we all go and look at them as well. I'm completely guilty of that. So what I was hoping to say, and I'm going to be a hypocrite in a minute, is I think it's a really good time to continue the conversation. I think we all need to join forces, the ecologists, the arborists, the consultants, and I just think we perhaps need to think more about this, perhaps have a bit more research into it, and hopefully we can leave these trees resilient for the future. So, because I've nearly finished, I'd just like to say, whilst I've got this platform, I'd like to say thank you to Ted. Ted has been really, really good to me. He's given me a lot of his time and also encouraged me to speak where I'm not sort of naturally sort of confident in doing this. And he's encouraged me to speak and also thinks outside of the box. But more importantly, I have the pleasure of hearing Ted speak quite regularly, and pretty much 90% of the times I hear him speak, he stands up and he waves the flag for arborists. He said the working people, he always talks about how important arborists are. And I don't know anyone else, who has the platform that he does that goes around the country and the world doing that for arborists. So on behalf of all the arborists, Ted, thank you.